gap in between. There's a gap where we meet. Where I am and you begin.
Okay, so after all this build-up and context, we are finally ready to talk about One More Day, which is easily the most controversial Spider-Man story ever written. No story before or since has had such a disproportionate effect on the narrative, characters, and continuity, far outreaching all of the prior stories we've talked about before. To summarize what remains, after Sin's pass, Aunt May's house is blown up by an old friend of Peter's in a dark parallel not unlike what happened to Harry, and so her, Peter, and Mary Jane move to the Avengers Tower. While there's decent bits here and there, I particularly love issue 525, which focuses on Aunt May's grief over losing her mother. It comes at the expense of the social context afforded by Peter being a school teacher in favor of setting up big events and crossovers with House of M, The Other, and Civil War. We don't have time to get into the messiness of these events. The important thing is that Peter unmasked due to Civil War to billions of people under the assumption that his family would be protected. And once Peter realizes his mistake, those protections are stripped away and things begin spiraling, with Aunt May taking a bullet from a sniper intended for Peter, in a desperate scramble to keep her alive while being a wanted man. This leads into the overall excellent Back in Black arc, along with sensational Spider-Man issue 40 and Annual 1, with the former having Peter talk to Marvel's version of God about Aunt May's impending death, and the latter showing how unbreakable Peter and MJ are despite it all, alongside providing insight into MJ's thoughts during the early days of their relationship. Things then fall into One More Day, where a desperate Peter tries to ask everyone in the Marvelverse for help, but is turned away by everyone except the villain Mephisto. In a long series of exchanges, Peter and MJ ultimately agree to give up their marriage in exchange for Aunt May's life, leading to a cosmic retcon where they were never married and both Peter and MJ are now single. Now, overall, I think this is a pretty bad story. It's really depressing in a way that I don't think it earns, and borderline nonsensical in its execution. Like, I firmly refuse to believe Dr. Doom, of all people, couldn't fix Aunt May. That man would raise a whole city if it meant doing something better than Reed's. It's a strange plot contrivance in service to a story trying to justify a storytelling decision that fundamentally doesn't make any logical sense, with Peter's motivations in particular feeling incredibly confused. While it does make sense he feels responsible for Aunt May being shot, since he often blames himself for things he only has limited control over, he also has a responsibility to Mary Jane as her husband, and I don't see any reality where he'd go against that even with a goofy trolley problem in his face. Now, while less common than it was before, I do sometimes see blame placed on JMS for One More Day, since he was the writer at the time, but the fault here lies with Editorial and the then editor-in-chief Joe Quesada. Quesada was developing the idea for the storyline once he took office in the year 2000, but was unable to work out the methodology until a creator summit in 2005, notably during the planning of the Civil War event. The reason why Peter's identity reveal was approved was because One More Day's retcon was the backdoor out of dealing with any long-term narrative consequences, since part of the deal, at least initially, was to have everyone forget his identity. While this does mean JMS was fully aware of One More Day by 2005 and was involved with the planning of it, he personally would have been fine keeping Peter and MJ married, since that was partly why he jumped onto the book initially. The fact that JMS's run ends with One More Day heavily indicates the editorial mandates drove him away, and it's only extremely recently he's come back for a limited series, which is very disheartening since the quality of his writing speaks for itself. When examining the issues themselves, what's notable is that not only is Quesada credited as editor-in-chief, and thus JMS would need to defer to his perspective on most events even in a more collaborative environment, but he was also penciler for all 4 issues and has a co-writer credit for the last one. JMS has confirmed in interviews that parts of issue 3 and most of issue 4 were rewrites done by the editorial office. While Quesada states that this was due to JMS wanting to retcon things in a way that conflicts with the plans for Brand New Day, I suspect thanks to context from Omit that it was Quesada wanting to convey his own artistic ideas for Peter and MJ as informed by his personal life, along with editorial reasons. Thus, to assess the meaning of the story, it becomes clear that it must be read from Quesada's perspective rather than JMS's due to how much influence and control he had over everything. This was not JMS's story by any stretch. At one point during the extensive One More Day interviews detailing the story's development, which credit where credit is due is something pretty rare nowadays, Quesada relays a story about how his mother hid the fact she had breast cancer until his father finally settled on buying a house after years and years of indecision. She did this because she knew her husband wouldn't go through with it if she put her own problems to the forefront, and she wanted to make sure her family was secure over her own life, which deprived them of her as a person after she tragically passed away. Quesada relates this to MJ's decision to say yes to Mephisto without allowing Peter to make his decision first, since she knew Peter and wanted the best for him. She makes a very strong sacrifice here, knowing that this will change her fundamentally as a person because of the concern she has for her husband. What this tells me is that Joe Quesada probably does have a genuine love for Peter and MJ as characters, but felt constrained by perceptions of marketability and storytelling for the future, and so in his eyes made a hard decision to help keep Spider-Man viable for the future, and so wrote a story that betrays both of them. Mary Jane sacrifices everything about her personhood for no benefit to herself, while Peter ultimately avoids his responsibility of Aunt May's injury and rewrites his life so he never had to make this decision. This dour, depressing way of doing a reset like this is true to the characters, but this feeling greatly contrasts with the stated goals of Brand New Day as a soft reboot to get back to basics. It's a separation between pre-OMD and post-OMD that the creators know isn't earned and haunts the story, but is bumbled on and heavily defended by Editorial now because of the intense and irrational dislike towards the marriage and to a large extent, outside of Quesada, Mary Jane. While we can apply nuance and complexity to all this, it's ultimately unnecessary since at the end of the day, the methods used to undo the marriage were done for cynical corporate reasons and are fundamentally against the strengths of comic books. Many readers were, and still are, completely turned off from reading mainline Spidey due to One More Day, and it can't ever really fade away in relevancy since the advent of trade paperbacks, reissues, and especially digital highlights the quality of the writing during the marriage period to new readers in a way that Editorial are unable to control. The math doesn't math, but we're pushed on regardless. After this, we entered the Brand New Day Initiative, a loose era of rotating creators publishing for the title thrice monthly, which starts with an indeterminate time skip and has a 2-page spread to help establish a new status quo. The marriage is out, nobody remembers Peter's identity except MJ, and Harry is alive now, I guess. As I alluded, JMS and Quesada behind the scenes had heavily debated the logistics of how the cosmic retcon would have worked within the context of the existing continuity. JMS was in favor of starting it from the drug trilogy onwards, with Peter taking the time to give Harry some help, which he had meticulously plotted out and would have also resulted in Gwen living. Quesada, meanwhile, wasn't concerned with the logistics, but didn't want to invalidate any existing stories, somewhat infamously saying, "It's magic, we don't have to explain it." He was also in favor of bringing back Gwen, but both were overruled by people at Marvel, thankfully. While you can certainly argue JMS's approach would have been more destructive, the fact is the lack of a solid foundation on what exactly the status was for various elements created a great many complications in the storytelling that could have been more easily solved if more than the rough sketches were established. You can certainly try to argue that it freed new writers from the shackles of existing continuity, but this is a misinformed position since continuity, as had been established previously, was never really a problem until the latest convoluted nonsense tried to retcon 20 years of stories. JMS had just done a highly successful run which blended both old and new extremely well, and the Brand New Day Initiative was already going to be focusing on new characters and situations. None of that planning necessitated a confusing cosmic retcon to function, and for the most part undermined some great talent since they couldn't really use anything before without further clarification from management on what was or was not canon. If you combine that with the rotating writing room calling to mind television productions, and you have a pretty rough start where stories are rather self-contained and unable to build upon each other, and a lot of mysteries that either don't get explained or have unsatisfying conclusions, Jackpot's identity was a continual tease since she could possibly be Mary Jane, only for it to be revealed she was a nobody LARPer taking drugs who eventually overdoses from a combination. I still don't have any clue on the web shooters, and things like Harry's reintroduction and Aunt May's house not being blown up required very strange fill-ins and retcons that further muddy matters. It took over a year in a random issue of Amazing Spider-Family for the initial confrontation between Harry and Peter to be canonized, And Harry doesn't really do much afterwards to warrant his presence as Peter's best guy friend over Flash. That isn't to say there aren't good stories and ideas in here, but that's vastly outweighed by the narrative having this gaping hole in it where the emotional center used to be, with Peter regressed to being a man-child stumbling through situations with no sense of growth or direction. Quesada eventually tried to sort things out with One Moment in Time, aka Omit, showing that Mephisto changing one small event allowed a criminal to escape before Peter and MJ's wedding, which caused a Rube Goldberg machine resulting in Peter missing the wedding, and MJ's aunt being attacked by that same criminal years later, leading to a breakup. Remember how I said JMS's pitch for the retcon was rejected for being more destructive to the continuity? Well, this version provides those problems to the marriage period, only worse since it argues you must substitute and change every story involving the marriage in your own head, so it's about dating instead. And also, Mary Jane apparently never got pregnant? Wait, what? Okay, so first, the idea of substituting for the post-marriage period is absurd. There are multiple stories specifically about how being married and moving in together changed Peter and MJ's perspectives, and multiple times they speak to each other in mature, supportive ways. Craven's Last Hunt is about Craven stealing 2 weeks of Peter and MJ's newlywed life away, built from the fact that DeMatteis was going through a divorce at the same time. It doesn't make sense to read these stories as them only dating, just so you can have the events but not the context, when the reason these stories are good is because of the original context informing the events. It also effectively removes Willie Smith's contributions to the wedding annual, with One Moment in Time's retelling notably omitting 2 scenes of him, along with other random parts which weren't deemed essential to bring forward. Willie Smith's work on Mary Jane's dress was intrinsically tied to the culture of New York in the mid-1980s, and he died due to social circumstances rooted in that context. But if you only see the events and not the context, then you can justify pretty much any erasure in service to a weaker and more broken canon. Quesada didn't even bother trying to write a dedication to him and his work. He clearly did not give the implications of what he's done any time of day. It's insulting and terrible, and just repeats the same mistakes. Second, the implication that Mary Jane never got pregnant at all. In one new scene, Mary Jane makes a bit of a bizarre and confusing argument, where she reveals she always imagined having a child with Peter, but due to how dangerous Spider-Man's life is, she doesn't feel comfortable bringing a child into their life. She then goes on to compare the dangerous Spider-Man to her abusive father, before concluding that she only wanted to get married to have kids, and if that's no longer part of the equation, then she doesn't need to get married at all, we'll just stay with Peter, I guess. There's several things wrong with this, the worst probably being MJ bringing up her father. Despite literally saying Peter would never do the things her father did, she still equates Spider-Man to the destruction her father brought to her family. It dichotomizes Peter and Spider-Man in a way that doesn't make sense for MJ to do, since her resolution to get married to him is entirely rooted in her understanding both sides of Peter are part of the same whole. If she genuinely felt so uncomfortable being with Peter that she has to kill her dreams of starting a family to be with him, then it doesn't really make sense they stayed together at all, actually. The sneaky part about this is Quesada's using MJ suddenly talking about kids as a way to avoid answering the question of if Peter wants kids or not, since under the logic of undoing the marriage, MJ is the disposable one in this scenario while Peter is infinite as the main character. Canonically, Peter does in fact want kids, he says so directly in Spider-Man number 15, but by retconning from the marriage annual onwards, they're trying to have their cake and eat it too by also wiping away the majority of parentage as it relates to Peter. All of the canonical power, none of the responsibility. Third, beyond pretty much every issue in a 20-span period catching strays from this mess, Clone Saga is now even more of a disaster since Mary Jane being pregnant is a critical plot component that most of its best stories are built upon. This is why most references to the Clone Saga in recent years only bring up events outside of the context they were built upon, without really doing the work to explain how the hell things happen now. For example, how did Ben die the way he did? The only reason they were in that specific location at that specific time was motivated by Peter being surprised by Norman while he was rushing to the hospital for Mary Jane as she was giving birth. If MJ never did that, then why are they here? Apply this to any baby reference and you start to see the problem. You'd essentially have to rewrite the entire saga in your head to justify the changes. And like with Sin's Past, there's little to no justification to do so when the retcon story it's being replaced with is substantially worse and less interesting. Like, wow, I sure love reading Clone Saga without the parts I actually liked. Thanks, Omit. If we're talking a pure quality argument in terms of what should or should not be canon, I'd easily argue the final adventure, Revelations, Rebirth, etc. deserve canonical status over omit, but the editors who control canon don't see things that way. With Brand New Day closing out in a confusing and muddled way, Dan Slott was given the reins on the story for about 8 years, making him third only to Stan Lee and Brian Michael Bendis in terms of tenure length. I'll try not to get too deep into this since I genuinely don't have any real animosity towards Dan Slott as a person, but I really dislike his run, I'm sorry. Like, the early stuff until Spider Island is solid if a bit rushed, and having some certified man-child moments. I liked Anna Marie in the early parts of Superior, but from there things started to feel dragged out, and I couldn't really get behind the whole tech CEO thing. Like, this boy couldn't balance a checkbook without Mary Jane, and now he's running around with gazillions of gadgets and millions of dollars at his disposal. Sorry, billions. It was an evolution that, while technically rooted in Peter's scientific background, didn't really feel natural or earned the same way as just working a decent job. It lacks any sense of grounded social context in favor of bigger and bigger events. Peter, as a school teacher, maybe didn't take advantage of his inventing skills the best, but it rooted him directly in the culture of New York and made him feel a lot more relatable because of his interactions with regular people, not weird comic book characters. Also, and this is one of the things Slott apologized for, so kudos for that at least, Silk's initial writing is so terrible that I'm shocked it made it to print. Like, everything to do with the pheromone business is so insanely rancid, holy hell. And it by effect made her solo books so much better since the writers did their best to keep the two of them apart. The handling of Mayday and Spider-Verse was also really bad and went against the intentions of her original creators, requiring a whole bunch of fixes to get her back on track. Not good, wish he hadn't have done it, I'm sure he regrets it. I get Slott has his fans, and I'm not arguing he didn't have meaningful things to contribute to the canon. Like, I am genuinely glad Silk was created, even if Slott wrote her terribly. Agent Venom's cool, and the conception of the Spider-Verse influenced by the 90s animated version did allow for some pretty interesting and creative one-shots, along with a pretty great spider-gwen run if you could put aside the various controversies with her creators. However, I think what's frustrating about Slott is how he sidelines many potential futures in service to the company's status quo, and his own ethos of putting the toys back in the box effectively means nothing Slott wrote for mainline matters long term. For clarity, a toys-in-the-box approach argues any new changes, storylines, and in more drastic cases characters, need to be put back in the proverbial box for the handoff to a new writer. This is extremely different from the approach from the 60s to the 90s, where the approach is more to have things progress naturally with each new run building upon the last. It calls into question what exactly we're snapping things back to, since often that presumed default status quo can rapidly become stale and dated. In this case, what Dan Slott did was snap things back to the start of Brand New Day, with the more interesting narrative implications of things such as Superior Spider-Man being relegated to spin-off series of varying quality, and not really impacting the mainline book on the whole. It would be like killing off Gwen Stacy, then right before Conway moved on, bringing her back and having Peter date her over MJ again, since after all, that was the status quo at the end of Lee's run. We already know that almost actually happened, but Conway correctly intuited how bad of an idea that would be and resisted it. So why then is it considered acceptable here to tidy up the story in such an unnatural way? We have characters who are entirely built on the continuity between runs, and if there's now no longer continuity between runs, that therefore means there's no functional way for characters to grow unless a drastic step is taken. It goes against the strengths of the medium. It creates a strange dissonance where Peter can be a tech billionaire that millions know, then go back to being a nobody at the drop of a hat. On his way out, Slott also attempts to limit creative choices for other writers. This is clear with Loki's appearance in issue 795, his first appearance in the story since JMS's run, which resolves the lingering favor by having Peter use it to save a random pedestrian, a situation Loki manipulated to prevent his removal as Sorcerer Supreme. Notably, there is a specific reference to One More Day here for an argument as to why Peter wouldn't want to turn back time too far. This limiting is also clear with issue 797, which has Peter and MJ briefly get together, only for Spider-Man to get in the way again, drama. So glad the same plot point from a decade ago gets to be rehashed. It's a bizarre way of handling things, but it's consistent with Slott's overall writing since Mary Jane still remains Peter's closest confidant, and is too important in that role to ever fully discard without giving a different love interest the same amount of narrative weight. Would have been interesting maybe to see how Carly or Black Cat reacted in these situations, but alas. For 8 long years, MJ existed primarily as a tool for specific story beats and a way to draw in readers hoping they'll finally get back that emotional core, but it always ends in a tease and feels really frustrating to read. This is the role she's set in, and this is where she'll stay. Or will she? Enter Nick Spencer's run, which of all the mainline runs after One More Day, I find this one to be the best, albeit messy. Despite what I just said of the state of Peter and MJ's relationship, the first issue here has them get together again, with the lingering issues MJ has with Peter's identity as Spider-Man more subdued, similar to the marriage period. While this does require ignoring a pretty significant fact established during Brand New Day in Slott's run, I'm fine with it since I think the justification that she can't be with Peter due to Spider-Man was itself a misunderstanding of what Omit said, where she actually blamed herself for putting her family in danger by proxy. We've been circling the ship for 10 years with no resolution. It's time for something different, and that difference happens to be them together. I think Spencer's character writing is solid, and some of the humor actually makes me laugh, but what really elevates things for me is how it takes the existential anxiety caused by OMD and Omit and makes it a core component of the story. Issue 29 is one of the most explicit about this, with Peter failing to see MJ off to the airport and revealing he was planning to propose to her, feeling this desire to want to change how their story always ends. When Peter re-enters his dreamscape during the Last Remains arc, he finds it to be desolate ruins rather than full of life. Something is lost, and as if to try to help answer his questions, a vision of Mary Jane emerges from the mist and reassures Peter before saying the answer is yes, the words she said to Mephisto sealing the deal. Sins play a large part in the thematics of the run, and it's here where Peter, despite not fully remembering, feels the weight of the world by casting Mary Jane into this role. He got what he wanted, and all it costed was the love of his life. It's a complex web of emotions, and it's rendered in such a hauntingly beautiful way by Patrick Gleason. Issue 60 feels a bit like Spider-Man vs. Wolverine in its metatextual qualities, where MJ oversees a bit of a therapy session to try to help Peter with his guilt. In a beautifully written monologue, Peter lays out the hell he's been stuck in for years. No kids, no marriage, struggling to make ends meet, losing more people he loves. He knows he can't keep going in this endless loop, but he lacks a means or understanding on how to stop it. It's such a raw and honest cry for things to be different, and sadly it fell on deaf ears. Spencer's run can be considered janitorial duty in how many plots are grappling with the mixed choices of his predecessors. This provides a lot more nuance to characters like Carly, and especially Black Cat, and at its best leads to stories like Hunted, a pretty fun event that helps to resolve the lingering fact that Kraven had been brought back to life during Brand New Day. It gives insight into Kraven's failures as a father, and helps to once again put him to rest in a thematically resonant way. I don't think Kraven should have been brought back in the first place, but Spencer does his best to respect the choices of previous writers. At its worst, we get to Kindred, who I don't mind as much as most folks, but they're a complicated mess with a cool design. As an embodiment of Peter's sins, they haunt a lot of stories and give a lot of monologues of varying quality, and at the end of the run, they're revealed to actually be 2 people, the Stacy twins from Sins Past, who were created by an AI version of Harry, who himself was manipulated by Mephisto thanks to his soul being sold to Norman. The memories that Norman and MJ had in Sins Past were implanted by Mysterio, and the Harry who's been around since Brand New Day is a clone. This complicated scheme all ties into One More Day, with the implication that Mephisto is doing all this to prevent a future where Mayday Parker overthrows his rule of the world. It's ambiguous to what extent this final twist was intended all along, or something that was changed with Spencer's sudden departure. Slott has stated that Spencer wanted to undo OMD, but never at any point received approval, and Cebulski confirmed that storylines were adjusted towards the end, which explains the focus shifting from Kindred being some version of Harry before One More Day to something else. Like with the Hobgoblin mystery, we're stuck with what we got until some retroactive material says otherwise. Personally, I'm very okay with retconning information from Sins Past, since that story didn't really fit into any sort of canon anyway. And I think it's interesting to show to what extent Norman has been such a failure for going the route of him genuinely trying to make amends. I don't personally agree with this turn for the character, but as a mirror to Peter, it's interesting how Norman is allowed to recognize and admit his sins, but Peter is not. Spencer's departure seemed to be the motivating factor for the Beyond storyline, which focuses on Ben Reilly for the first time in ages, with a rotating staff of writers and various miniseries. I particularly like Jeffrey Thorne's issue of Hobby Brown, and the MK Black Cat miniseries has a really solid conversation at the end breaking down the unfair Betty-Veronica dynamic they keep getting slotted into. What sours the whole thing, though, is the ending. Basically, Ben loses his memories due to the Beyond Corporation and blames Peter for it, becoming the villain Chasm in the process. Peter and MJ plan to move in together, only to be suddenly interrupted by a foreboding figure. Cut to the beginning of the Zeb Wells run, and we're given a vague mystery box with a 6 months later time skip, with Peter back to living with Aunt May, MJ with a new man named Paul and kids, and everything being really sad, cynical, and depressing. I mean, it foreshadows the rest of the run, which is also sad, cynical, and depressing, but I can't say it gets me excited for more adventures with deadbeat Peter over here. I can say with little hesitation, and with no particular animosity towards Zeb Wells, that this is the worst mainline run for the character. I can barely stand to read how poorly they're doing, my boy, it's crazy, and Mary Jane somehow got it worse with the dead language plotline. If you're wondering what Peter did, like the marketing was saying, after being dragged into an alternate dimension by nobody villain Raven, and subsequently forced out by Mary Jane to protect him, Peter works tirelessly to rescue MJ, only to find that 4 years, or what felt like 4 years, had passed in the days he was gone, and boom, there's MJ with Paul and adoptive kids. When Raven returns to Earth, he wants to sacrifice the Scarlet Woman, Great Slang Zeb, in a really convoluted mess that results in Miss Marvel, Kamala Khan, dying for about 5 minutes so she can be retooled into a mutant and star in endless nostalgia bait. It's a really poorly written storyline, and discards the development of multiple women for the sake of pure edginess and brand synergy. There's even visual allusions to the night Gwen Stacy died, as if the reason that story was good was simply because a woman died, and not the realistic depictions of grief and long-term consequences it had for the title. Kamala was not a major character in Zeb's run before this. She actually had way more development in other titles not involving Peter, and her death, while framed as heroic, mostly comes across as confusing, was undone extremely quickly afterwards, and even got mind-wiped by Emma Frost, so nobody even remembers that she died anyway. For Mary Jane, this means that her having to live one of her greatest fears, being a foster mother and completely dependent on a man who may be abusive, is treated as simple fact with very little discussion between her and Peter on how messed up a situation this actually is. The children she has were chains created by Raven to keep her near Paul, totally not a weird thing to write by the way, and disappeared once they served as sufficient motivation to keep Peter and MJ apart. MJ is effectively rebooted into a different person, heavily codependent, and it's done in such a mid-way with no real payoff in the narrative unless you genuinely want to count her stint as Jackpot. And potentially, this maybe could have worked better if done in a similar style to the Magic miniseries from the 1980s, which chronicled the changes Ileana had to go through in an alternate dimension where time flows different from the normal world. That was 4 issues, almost entirely focused on women and their perspectives on losing innocence in the face of cruel reality, and could have easily been applied to MJ to help the audience at least understand what she's dealing with in a real way. However, the purpose of this change in MJ was not to meaningfully engage with her as a character with a rich history, it was to justify keeping her away from Peter. Her derailment is ultimately about Peter and Paul, not her. This radical shift makes even more sense when you consider the fact that it was more than likely intended for Nick Spencer's run to end with a marriage proposal. We know that things were adjusted by Editorial. The cover of his last issue sure looks like it's celebrating a wedding, and most damning of all, a variant cover to 877 prominently shows MJ with a wedding ring, with some drawings inside also having it. While it appears to be on the wrong hand, judging from how strangely MJ flips between sides of Peter in these panels, it heavily indicates the drawings themselves were quickly flipped around before publication. At no point before or after this is it established that MJ wears rings on her hands for fun or aesthetics, and the ring itself is a gold band like the one Peter was shown having, but mysteriously never presented to her, despite there being narrative setup for it in Sinister War 1. He even alludes to the proposal being an after-credits scene, which sure seems to match up with this last scene here, don't you think? When you see all these elements coming together and how they played out, it kind of becomes inevitable to see this sudden shift into breaking Peter and MJ up as something stronger than simple dislike. And we know from other cases, creatives are unable to fully express what is going on with their runs until NDAs expire. It all leads back to the core of the story being lost and Editorial refusing to see the rot. No kids, no marriage. We're spinning in a spiral. After more Zeb events I don't have time to get into, we now get to the current Joe Kelly run, which is not amazing. We're essentially back to the brand new day status quo, only Peter's social life has almost entirely cratered despite a lot of text insisting he's got stuff going on. The most insulting bit would probably be the accidental kinda polyamorous relationship he's into with Shay and Black Cat, which once again frames Cat as the bad girl to some other woman. This is despite the fact that Cat is far and away the more interesting character to Shay, who by contrast sadly feels like a placeholder that I'm sure will be forgotten once they stop writing her. There's nothing particularly wrong with writing polyamory, it'd just be nice to actually do something with it rather than this bland garbage. More importantly, now that we're finally at the present, we can see how the rot of One More Day infects the rest of the other related titles in the Spider-Verse, forcing some rather strange directions since it'd look bad if Peter remained a man-child while everyone else moved past him. This results in overall civilian supporting casts going way down, and wacky superhero antics going way up. This is why we get decisions like Eddie being bonded to Carnage, Spider-Gwen getting her own somehow worse version of One More Day, MJ bonding to Venom, which at least beats out Jackpot since it led to her and Paul breaking up, thank you Lord. And, oh yeah, Gwen is Dark Gwenpool. Hey, remember when I brought that up over 2 hours ago? Well, we've finally arrived, hooray. Okay, so Gwenpool, short for Gwendolyn Poole, is a legally distinct character separate from both Gwen Stacy and Deadpool. Her first series, The Unbelievable Gwenpool, is pretty solid. I'm more mixed on the stuff afterwards, although her being revealed as Arrow Ace is cool, I guess. Shoutouts to the Arrow Ace community. Cut to now, and she's in a limited series featuring, supposedly, the original Gwen Stacy as Dark Gwenpool in a sort of metatextual critique of darker and grittier reboots. Now, putting the Stacy aside for a moment, one of the core problems with this idea is that Dark Gwenpool was already explored in 2016, and there it's done quite a lot better, since it has nothing to do with legacy characters so much as Gwendolyn's interior reality. What kind of life does a sad, lonely young adult want, and how do comic books feed into that escapism? Her rejection of a more stable future as a villain shows that she retained feelings of empathy and compassion for the characters around her, which completes her nice little character arc. There's a lot of layers there, which I feel were handled wonderfully. And it honestly feels like a huge step backwards to have her be dealing with Gwen when she's already established herself as a character separate from that. It's a cul-de-sac of a plot, since whether this is actually Gwen or not, we already know she's going to either re-die or be sent off in some way, since an event this huge wouldn't be contained to a side series. We're repeating story beats that are over 50 years old by this point because of a stubborn refusal to move forwards. There wouldn't be such a need to keep going back to the Gwen well if other women in the Spidey stories were given proper focus and agency, which we were starting to get with Nick Spencer's run before that sudden pivot. Part of the appeal of Gwenpool, which I think Lee Williams explained well, is how she mediates conversations between fans and creators, and the conversation here is just a strawman interpretation of what 90s antihero Edge was supposed to be. When if we really want to get into a deep dive critique, you'd have to start looking into structural problems with the industry. This leads us into our final topic, an attempt to try to reconcile all these problems and provide a way forwards. And it all starts with Miles Morales. In terms of new creations for the Spidey canon, far and away the most popular and influential has been Miles. Created by Brian Michael Bendis, Alex Alonso, and Sarah Pichelli in 2011 for the Ultimate Universe, Miles is an Afro-Puerto Rican teenager who inadvertently serves as that universe's Spider-Man successor after Peter's death, thanks to, you got it, a bite from a radioactive spider. Unlike Peter, who starts at 16 years old, Miles starts at only 13, in addition to having to deal with Spider-Man's legacy, which eventually culminates in him receiving the blessing from both 616 and Ultimate Peter. There are many factors contributing to why Miles was created, and it's worth keeping in mind that his creation was in no way inauthentic or a publicity stunt. Initially, there were talks for his character for the event Ultimatum a few months before Barack Obama became president. That event prattled through 2009, and the Death of Spider-Man story began in February 2011. In May 2010, a fan suggested Donald Glover for the role of Spider-Man, which started a Twitter campaign that was reported on the news and had Glover's support, which didn't lead to an audition but did attract the attention of Brian Michael Bendis. With information from the 2012 Sony leaks, we know that as part of the negotiation for the rights to adapt Spider-Man, certain qualities of both Peter and Spider-Man were agreed upon by Sony and Marvel. Most relevant here, the idea that Peter must be Caucasian. This contract was effective September 15, 2011, a year and change after this campaign. When you consider that part of the campaign's purpose was critiquing why exactly Spider-Man being white was important, when Spider-Man the icon is not defined by race, it feels a bit pointed to specifically note what race Peter should be for adaptations. While this agreement doesn't preclude creating a different character who uses the Spider-Man mantle unrelated to Peter, realistically speaking, that was not something Sony was interested in doing at the time or now whatsoever. Spider-Man 4 was officially cancelled in January 2010, and the reboot was being developed with that Raimi mold in mind, which itself was a series heavily influenced by Ultimate Spider-Man, which has been noted at the time for actually being less inclusive than comparative stories were in the 1960s. So with all this in mind, you can see how Brian Michael Bendis and Alex Alonso took a lot of critiques people had of the Ultimate Comics to heart and wanted to redefine Spider-Man for the 21st century. Notably, Miles' uncle Aaron is this universe's version of the Prowler, which is a nod to Hobie Brown's legacy and the importance of him putting on the Spider-Man suit all the way back in issue 87. This isn't to say there aren't some deep dive critiques one can make of Bendis' handling of Miles. I've read quite a few, both positive and negative, that I found pretty interesting. Just that it does seem like he made a legitimate attempt to course correct, more than likely also influenced by wanting to give his adoptive daughters someone to identify with. I'm a pretty big Miles fan. I really love how the intersections of his identity allows for the exploration of different communities in a way that's not really possible with Peter. I've read the 3 major runs he's had in the comics, along with the 2 graphic novels by Justin Reynolds, and overall my favorite is the current ongoing by Cody Ziegler. It feels like a solid teenager comic and matches the right energy for the character, and it's nice to have one Spider-Verse character in the modern day who is able to meaningfully grow and change through a building up of context. He kind of has everything that Peter used to have, the romance, the support system, the social relevancy, and so on. And that tends to rub Peter fans the wrong way due to this perception that Miles is getting more favorable treatment than him, which sometimes escalates into the idea that Miles is replacing Peter. I don't agree with this much at all, since even when Peter is being treated poorly, he is still the focus of far more comics than Miles, and is more misattributing the deeper issues to something much more surface. While it is true there is continuity between runs with Miles, the progression of his life and by extension his age has massively slowed down once he was integrated into 616. This notably means that Miles hasn't left high school for over a decade, compared to Peter leaving in 3 years. We've already talked about how this slowing of progression affected Peter over the course of decades until the puttering stop that was One More Day, so you would expect this to also apply to Miles with him being stuck in high school, limiting his storytelling potential. While this hasn't happened yet due to a stronger supporting cast and lateral progress of Miles' powers developing further, there is indeed an upper limit, and it's all defined by what is being done to Peter. Miles isn't a new character siphoning off the success of Peter for his own stories. Peter is an old character siphoning off the success of the Spider-Verse. Once you understand that, a lot of the weirder narrative decisions make much more sense. If a younger high school Peter Parker was apparently the holy text we've been straying away from all these years with college and marriage, why then is it the case that every single time Peter has been adapted for live action, it is pulling from source material far outside that initial 28-issue range? It implies something about Peter as a high schooler doesn't work long term, and it again gets us all the way back to where we began. This dismissal of continuity and progression in my eyes goes hand in hand with issues relating to diversity and creator rights. Creators are in an ecosystem in which their art form is being denigrated by marketing and executives in order to create a more bland product that can then be used for adaptations, and are being compensated terribly for their work. Peter David passed away recently due to long-term medical problems, which were exacerbated by financial hardships leading to his family creating a GoFundMe. The influence of his work speaks for itself, and yet he is one of many victims of an exploitative system that only wants the events and not the context, the content without the people. Creators are usually paid per page with no holiday pay, sick pay, or healthcare, in a field which more often than not requires contributing hours of free labor to even get a foot in the door. To loop back around to Christopher Priest, he had a very interesting interview in 2018 expressing many of his problems with the comic book industry. I think it's correct that a collaborative environment over time has been sacrificed for what is more marketable, which disproportionately affects non-white creators. The issues with Peter not being married are far beyond just what it does to the story. It speaks to a lack of agency for many creatives to meaningfully contribute to a canon, since they're being forced into specific boxes either textually or in their actual jobs. The solution to fixing this isn't simple, but let's see what we can try to do. Representation remains a consistent problem, with some comments from folks like Brevwort saying there are no viable black male mutants being a pretty succinct summary of where we're at there. Fixing this first requires context and information, of which I've provided an extensive, but not by any means comprehensive, amount with regards to Spider-Man's history with black characters as they lead into Miles. Racial representation is important, and along with that, the types of stories for all characters needs to stretch and shift. It doesn't really work to confine so many characters into such rigid and boring boxes simply because a handful of people at the top says it needs to be that way. This requires changes at the top level, with greenlighting of more varied and interesting material with the assumption that creators do know what they're doing. Jim Shooter's legacy is quite complex and honestly warrants its own exploration, but Priest speaks positively about not just his business sense, but the ways in which he tried to put comic creators first in the comics industry rather than as cogs for the machine. He did his best to increase payments and royalties to Marvel staff, something I don't think I've ever heard about from current executives at the company. And his clear passion for comics led into a commercial and creative peak in the 1980s that we've arguably haven't moved beyond. He wanted to move Marvel into being independent and ultimately failed because that threatened profits. Always the profits, which is ironic since comic book sales have been pretty abysmal for a long time due to how poor distribution is. Priest also notes this in that interview, where he encouraged Milestone to start drop-shipping issues to beauty salons and barbershops, since those are places where people of color return to every week. That is meeting customers where they're at, and moves the center of physical distribution away from comic book stores, which are often stigmatized, perhaps not inaccurately, as fairly insular. Above all, creators need better pay and more rights. Situations like what happened with Peter David must not be repeated, and that's going to require a multifaceted approach to solve. There's unionization, which has a long history in the industry, and if you're aware of your local one, then I encourage you to research and support them. For specific issues with current titles at Marvel, it's still possible to write in your thoughts in letter format, which are usually printed in the back pages of releases. So if you're passionate about the Spidey marriage or any other issue, that's another avenue. There's also moving beyond the big two in mainstream comic books on the whole towards independent comics. This is something I myself am trying to improve on, since while I do read a lot of mainstream works, I recognize that my support there has far less of a material effect compared to independent. If you have any suggestions for specific independent comics to read, go ahead and sound off in the comments and I'll do my best to highlight them. Ultimately, who controls the past controls the future, and who controls the future controls the past. We need to do the work now to understand the past and future in order to create a path forward to the things we want. Things will change, and things are changing. You can help too.
And I say, oh, here it goes again. I can see the times are changing, and I'm missing what was there.
Bendición, mami.
Que Dios te bendiga.